Well, Matt, we're going from kind of blinking red in, what are the signals and indicators of what might happen next to understanding how businesses need to be thinking about what might be coming down the pipeline. And so I'm happy to announce our next session as we move along very quickly today, the corporate situation room, how companies should be preparing for Taiwan based on lessons from Ukraine. And joining us is Kelly Bissell, who is a Chief Vice President or Corporate Vice President, I think that's the right way to say it, at Microsoft. Rick Ledgett, former Deputy Director of the National Security Agency, one of our favorites at the Cyber Initiatives Group. Unfortunately, Sue Gordon was scheduled to meet with us today as well and join in this session. She sends her regrets. She got held up for something that she really had no control over, so we're going to give her a pass. So all the pressure on Kelly and Rick. Matt, over to you.
Thank you so much. We'll give it a second. There we go. We see Kelly now. All right. So in this session, we're looking at how corporate America, and we're really talking kind of that C-suite boardroom type environment, really saw the Ukraine incident and the invasion from a risk perspective, how they responded, and what are they going to do in prep for a Taiwan situation that kind of matches this type of intensity and challenge. So I think I'll kick us right off. And Kelly, I'll start with you and then move to Rick. Do we think, candidly, that boardrooms did respond? I know that there were a lot in the cyber community that did. I know there were a lot in the kind of critical infrastructure that are kind of tied in to the regular faces you would see at, say, a CISA meeting or at a White House meeting. But do you think this was a wake-up call across C-suites that global insecurity or kind of that flash of a geopolitical incident needs to move up their priority list?
Well, the short answer is I don't think they woke up enough. I actually think they were more woke up from COVID disruption than they were Ukraine-Russia disruption. And I just think that the makeup of the board needs to shift a fair amount to get better representation of either technology or really security awareness, because we're at that intersection of geopolitical risk, technology risk, and regulatory risk. So I just think that the board has not yet woken up enough.
All right, Rick, right over to you.
Yeah, I might disagree a little bit with Kelly to say that I've seen a big uptick in actions from the board and from the CEOs and CIOs and CISOs that I've dealt with over the last year plus in my consulting side of my business. And so they are absorbing information and they are taking action. They haven't appointed a bunch of cyber people to their boards. That has not happened, to Kelly's point. But the people who are there are paying more attention. And I also agree with Kelly that it's not enough, but we do have their attention. And I think Jen Easterly's Shields Up comment was brilliant, and it's shorthand that expresses a whole lot of stuff rolled up in that. So I just worry now about people getting tired of having their shields up. But we can talk about that more later if you'd like.
Yeah, and so
and maybe if I could add one thing to that, Rick, like I think you're right. I think they're aware, they're not actually prepared yet. To General Alexander's point before around, we're not ready for that resilient sort of footprint. And I think there's just more to do, especially with the pressure of economic pressure, because they're trying to do just enough, not getting ready for the next wave, if that makes sense.
Well, that's a perfect tee up, and Rick, I'll turn it right back to you. So now that we have executives' attention, like Shields Up has gotten their eyes on the prize, what are the questions they should be asking of their own board or their own C-suite in response to these types of activities?
Yeah, that's a great question, Matt. I think there's 4 things that I tee up when I talk to people about this. One is that you're careful about drawing too many analogies between Ukraine and Taiwan. They're very different situations. For example, Taiwan is an island. There are no friendly countries that border it through which you could funnel material and weapon systems. And so, in order to get stuff to the fight, if it's not already there on the island, you're going to have to run probably a blockade, a PRC blockade. And that's got huge implications for the amount and scale of material that you can push to Taiwan. And it also applies to people getting out of Taiwan. So, for example, out of the Ukraine, all the companies that I know pulled their people out. They took software developers, they pulled them out to Poland or elsewhere in Europe. There was a lot of that went on. You're not going to be able to do that through a blockade. And so you just need to think about that ahead of time. That's thing one. Thing two is that, like Ukraine was for Russia, Taiwan has been the PRC's test bed for offensive cyber, both CNE and CNO. And so as they do that, and as they ramp up towards an actual invasion, one thing that I think companies should do is look at the CNO situation in Taiwan and look for an elevated rise. And that's an indicator. It's not a definitive sign, but it's an indicator. I also agree with what Keith Alexander said in the last session, that the attacks against the U.S. would also be a key indicator. Third thing is that you need to keep in mind supply chains. It's not just stuff that's made in Taiwan for your business that you need to be concerned with. It's second and third order effects. It's stuff that's made somewhere else with parts from Taiwan that you need to look at in order to keep your supply chain safe. And the last thing is you need to keep in mind the way things have worked out in the Ukraine with Russia, in terms of, as businesses tried to divest and get out of Russia, they had incredibly difficult conditions put on them. There's huge pressure from the US and Western Europe on companies that were still in Russia, and you can expect the same thing to happen with companies that are still in China. But getting people and equipment and yourselves out of Taiwan, besides the physical aspect of it, is going to be difficult because of the regulatory aspect. I just read today, it was that Russia put a 50% donation from companies that are selling assets in Russia. So half your money goes to the state directly. So that kind of thing.
And passing it over to Kelly. So with that being said, is there a cyber element or another set of questions from your internal view outside of the four that Rick laid out?
Yeah, look, I'll call Rick Professor Rick, because he is definitely smart and thinking about these four things. I totally agree with him on this. We got to get the right leadership, I think, on the board so we can hold management accountable to think about these future things, not just the operating things, the current operations. Second thing, he is dead on when it comes to the supply chain potential disruption and the practical complexities around that. So I think companies need to think about what is their secondary supply chain and even tertiary, and how do I work through those practical issues today? Because if things happen bad, they don't have time to go through those plans. It's too late. And then I think on their company side, from a cybersecurity standpoint, how could they be resilient? How could they pivot to any attack as it might happen so they could be resilient against those attacks? And then maybe the last thing, I'll just offer a few things. One is, so define their secondary, tertiary supply chains, store up all their OT, because that's where attacks are likely to happen. And I think our weakest points around OT security, I think even the Ukraine Colonel Kalabashkin said that. I would say be brilliant at the basics around cyber hygiene. Still, we see 90% of all the successful attacks are against this lack of hygiene. And then maybe the last thing I'll say is get to know law enforcement now. Still today, they wait for something bad to happen, and then they figure out who their FBI contact is. They got to do that now so they know the organization and they have a relationship. So if you know what hits the fan, they can actually move quickly.
Yeah, and we heard that from Cynthia with FBI earlier. Get to know your local FBI office, especially if you're small or medium, especially talking about that supply chain aspect. There may be, it's not necessarily a big corporation, but a small. We may not be dealing with boards as much as kind of partnerships that have to kind of weed into these as well. And so, Rick, with that being said, how do we talk to boards right now about this threat of Taiwan, and without being too chicken little, too Pollyanna, at the same time, really conveying the steps that need to take place now so that they're prepared for later. The big gotcha that everybody wanted to throw back at the cyber community after the first few days of the Ukrainian invasion was, see, Russia didn't do anything. That's not necessarily the case. There was a lot of great preparation that went in and bolstered a lot of resilience and strength in there to keep that quiet. So I turn to you, like, how do we talk about it now so that with the rearview mirror of, oh, well, we didn't see a lot of Russian activity, what do we do?
So I think there's a couple of things you can do. One is companies that are in China, that are invested in China, have presence in China. There's an ongoing effort to help them understand the risk they're taking with their IT system extended into China. And especially if they don't have it segmented and firewalled the right way, it's a huge risk. And so you can use, in fact, we do use that as a pivot point to talk about what would happen if the balloon goes up in Taiwan. And you're right, it's one of those, you can argue about the probability. Personally, I think it's a fairly low probability, but a very high impact event. Ask me next week, my view on the probability may be different, but right now I think it's still a fairly low probability. And so having people understand their current exposure and the risks that pose, and then it's once you can get them to that point, then it's an easier conversation to say, okay, now you need to plan for the what ifs.
All right, Kelly, let's say you get brought in to give this brief. Where do you start on your what's the temperature right now?
Yeah, so I mean, I would put it in context of 30 or 40 boards that I've spent time with the last 18 months. And maybe I'll share what they don't want to hear and what they do want to hear. What they don't want to hear is FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, especially if we're going to talk through the lens of techno speak, cybersecurity speak, because they don't understand it, and we should expect them to. Here's what they do want to learn. They want to understand their value chain of their business. So if you're a pharmaceutical company, I have joint ventures with all these universities all over the world. I have various plants all over the world. I do clinical trials. I do drug manufacturing. I do drug distribution. They know that business. And so what we have to do is step through that value chain of that business and help them understand how to secure it, how to be compliant with various laws and regs, and how to have backup plans or these resilience plans so that they can be safe across their value chain. And again, the way you should talk about it for pharmaceutical is very different from a telco or a bank or an automotive manufacturer. So you have to really drill it through the language of that business. And if we do that, then they can create the right plans to move forward to be resilient against, hopefully, those, not the attacks, but hopefully they could be resilient about anything.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think more and more we're seeing boards who want to hear about geopolitical issues. They want to hear about how this particular event that happened in part of the world can affect their business. And so, and it's not a really difficult line to draw or story to tell, but you have to be able to speak the language of geopolitics and speak the technical language and do the translation and the back and forth. And that's where I think having someone from outside the company can help that space.
So we got a quick question in here, and it's from Tom Stoyama. It says, how does the DoD, the IC, whomsoever government persuade groups like an Apple or someone that has a lot of manufacturing or efforts that are going place in China now, that ultimately this is not a reliable partner, and that a Taiwanese invasion or something serious that could disrupt their business is imminent?
I always defer to Rick, Professor Rick, on this one.
Yeah, also, Apple's a tough one. The U.S. government's had a lot of dealings with Apple over time, and they've not been really receptive to lots of the conversations that we've had. But I would say that the effect of a invasion of Taiwan on Apple would be catastrophic, and it would also undoubtedly result in the kind of commercial and public sector government-led backlash against Apple and the products that they produced. And so I don't think it's in Tim Cook's interest at all to have anything like that happen. That said, their business model works for them, and I don't see it changing anytime soon.
Well, with that in mind, and how we saw the Shields Up campaign around Ukraine, is there something that could be a product of a joint sealed FBI, cyber, and CISA product? Like, where can the government start to foot stomp this message? And what type of products would resonate in the boardroom? Are we looking for something that the government can amplify in the public sphere? Because we're not talking about getting people into SCIFs. We're talking about unclassed products that we can put in hand. What could be helpful for boards today as we move forward and as there is a perceived escalation?
Yeah, maybe I'll start if that's all right. Look, I think what Chris Krebs did to start CISA was really good, and I think Jen has taken it and improved it, but I think there's more to do. We've made a lot of progress in this public-private partnership. The information flow is not yet at the speed of the attack. You know, it's much slower than that right now. And again, I think that we should probably do two main things. One, how does the private sector, the Apples, the Microsofts, the Googles, how does the private sector work together, which we already do, but we could work better together. How do we work better together and actually have more timely information, in this case with CISA and other parts of law enforcement, and have it reciprocal? Because we have to be able to really share things at the speed of the attack, not by phone call, because if we don't, then we're always going to be behind. Back to what General Alexander was talking about, we're not really prepared and resilient. So we've got to move that, and not just in the high-tech areas, but food. This is what Chris Krebs talked about, food, water, all the basics that really keeps this country going. And if we do those things, then I think we can respond. We can be resilient against these things. It's easier said than done.
If I can take a slightly different tack on your question, in terms of convincing companies and the public of the threat from China, what needs to happen, I think you've seen that increasing over the last couple of years. Certainly, the Chinese surveillance balloon helped elevate it to a level of near hysteria. One thing that the DoD is doing now that they did before that I think is brilliant is in 1985, they started producing this glossy document they called Soviet Military Power. And every year they did it, and it was an intel-based but totally unclassified publication that they put out that talked about here's what the Russians are doing with photographs and everything else of missiles and weapon systems and that sort of thing. And they did that year over year, and what it built up in the community writ large and the commercial sector was a sense of, holy mackerel, this is a real threat. And about 2 years ago, the DoD started doing that with China. I think that's exactly the right kind of thing you need to do. Foundational work, but that leads to good things.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we've got the last few minutes. If anybody has a question, throw it in the chat. Kelly, let me just turn to you. Do you have any closing thoughts or anything you'd like to add that we didn't cover on sort of that board dialogue?
Yeah, just a few things. I think that the board has made progress. They are in that awareness stage. I think the SEC, as we all know, is trying to figure out what is the stance for a cyber aware person on the board. They do need really that body of knowledge on cyber plus geopolitics like we talked about. They have to really think about through the whole value chain of their business and how geopolitics, and this all started way back in North Korea even, how geopolitics affect those private sectors in not just their own core business, but their third parties, fourth parties, fifth parties of that ecosystem of that business. And so I think that the boards need to really take a deeper, more holistic approach for this. They're not management, right? So they're not going to make management decisions, but they have to really go deeper in that to question and hold management accountable. So that would be my suggestion, is go deeper, better with these things.
All right, Rick, we'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I agree with what Kelly said. I think that is important for boards to do, and I think I'm seeing that in some boards, including a couple of the boards that I'm on, where we engage in dialogue with the CEO, but we also have detailed discussions with the CIO or the CISO about what's going on in the company, and we'll spend a half day out of cycle, not in conjunction with the board meeting, to deep dive on an aspect of technology or that sort of thing. What that does is it makes us smarter. It also sharpens their attention, because the board's paying attention to this. I need to pay attention to it, and it causes a conversation to happen between the entity that we're talking to and the CEO. So I think all in all, it's a very good thing, and I think more of that would be good.
Excellent. Well, gentlemen, the boards that are in your hands are in good hands. We just need to get you guys to scale and get that attention everywhere. So thank you so much for the time today.
Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you.
The Cipher Brief, because national security is everyone's business.